This is a series called The Argument for God, Episode 2, Mankind, Random Mutations of Blind, Pitiless Indifference, or Intentional Creation of an Intelligent Designer. Come with us on the journey to find out if it's settled science or if there's room for debate.
All right, let's do this. Here we are.
Yeehaw!
Where do we start?
Well, I find it interesting. So what we're discussing today is kind of an argument of, I guess, is there some type of creator behind man and the universe, or is it purely undirected scientific process?
For sure, scientific processes.
Yeah.
100%.
So, what's interesting to me is that the basis of science is, well, so let's look at where science comes from, okay? Because if we say the world is science, then we have to kind of understand what is science and where does it come from. The interesting part for me is that science in and of itself is based on some religious axioms, okay? Because the main axioms for science is, first off, that the universe is intelligible, okay? Meaning that we can discover truth through scientific discovery. Well, the saying that the universe is ordered or that it's intelligible really flies in the face of neo-Darwinists' explanations, which we'll get into talking about epistemology, which is mankind's ability to comprehend the world around him. But believing that the universe is ordered is a religious axiom, okay? Because that's saying that it came from order. It's a rational, it's not just a, random mutation, blind, pitiless indifference. It's none of those things. If that were the case, it wouldn't be ordered, or we wouldn't believe it was ordered.
Yeah.
Okay. The second is that truth is rational, so that what we can discover is actually rational, that it makes sense and we can comprehend it. And the last is that the pursuit of finding this truth is good, because good is moral. And the moral argument doesn't work in a scientific materialist worldview. And so it's interesting to me just to think about science in and of itself being based on religious axioms before you even get into what science understands. Okay. So these are not scientific claims that the universe is intelligible, that truth is rational, and that the discovery of truth is good. These are metaphysical claims, right? Which is a branch of philosophy that talks about the basic fundamentals of reality, examining the basic fundamentals of reality.
Yep.
So scientists don't like theologians, but they themselves are actually theologians.
So what if I'm nihilistic about this, right? And I think that there's this idea of an infinite spectrum of name the thing, right?
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's say that you are nihilistic about it. Then what is the reason for the pursuit of science? Because you can't tell me it's good.
Some sort of biased, maybe,
Yeah. So the problem you're having here is that there is no logical answer.
So, but it probably comes down to some sort of biased, selfish reasoning that humans want
Machiavellian?
to ultimately be right.
So
right?
Machiavellian?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, we know what happens when the world becomes Machiavellian. That's no good, right? And for those of you that don't know what Machiavellian tactics are, that's interacting with people, using them as a means to an end.
Yeah.
So justifying the means because of the end. Machiavellian is manipulating people to get something for yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So Machiavellian tactics basically says there is no morality. Everything's game.
Yeah.
And you can be as manipulative and deceitful and destructive as you want to be in order to get to where you want to go.
Yeah. The ultimate level of narcissism.
Yes. So it's okay, maybe as a nihilist and a Machiavellian, you could make sense of science in some way to get what you wanted. But is that the world that we want to exist in? Well, I would argue no. There may be some that argue yes, but that to me seems like insanity.
Yeah.
So, right? It's that's difficult. Francis Bacon, who discovered the scientific method, right? He said a couple interesting things. he put a quote above Cambridge University. Cambridge is the first scientific laboratory in the world.
Yeah.
And above Cambridge's door, it says, "Majestic are the works of the Lord. Those who delight in him study them." So interesting to note that Cambridge, Oxford, these early institutions, universities of science, universities came from religion. Oxford and Cambridge are laid out as monasteries. So Bacon, who discovered the scientific method, actually was using it in discussion of Scripture. So they were trying to find empirical truth in Scripture and how to lay that out. And he created the scientific process. But it was through studying religious text that it initially came about. So he said that the book of God's words are the Bible, and that the book of God's works is the scientific discovery, the world around us, right? And so he talks about, reading the book of God's words and the book of God's works. And he attributes science to God and the rationality of the universe and our ability to comprehend it, and right, some of those religious axioms we talked about at the beginning. So I just find that interesting. Now, the Enlightenment period of science, which Nietzsche called the death of God, which men basically said like, oh, we don't need to rely on an intelligent creator in order to discover the truths of the universe around us. Man's own capability is all we need, right?
Yeah.
So like Copernicus, there's a principle called the Copernican Principle, which is kind of like this idea of the reduction of everything down to its simplest form.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason they say that is because Copernicus is the one that discovered that we didn't live in a geocentric world or a geocentric solar system, but that we orbited the sun. And so essentially what they're positing here is that Earth, they thought, was this special thing that was the center of the universe, but it's actually not. And so they basically, the Copernican principle is that you're not special. Nothing is special. Man isn't special. Our place in the universe isn't special. The universe that's been created around us isn't special, right? We kind of, in our first episode, debunked a lot of that in showing how special the fine-tuning parameters of the universe are and some of these other aspects. But it's interesting because Copernicus, in and of himself, believed that we were very special.
Yeah.
He believed that we were created from God. I mean, I have a quote here from Copernicus, that kind of talks about that. So I say, Nicholas Copernicus' heliocentric model of the solar system is acknowledged as the first convincing scientific demonstration that we humans are not the focal point of the cosmos. We now realize that Copernicus' result is but one of a series of nested demonstrations overthrowing long-held assumptions regarding humanity's special status. We're not located at the center of the universe. We're not even made of the dark ingredients constituting the vast majority of the universe's mass. Such cosmic downgrading exemplifies what scientists now call the Copernican Principle. In the grand scheme of things, everything we know points towards humans not being or occupying a privileged position. But it's interesting to me, if you go read Copernicus, that's not how Copernicus thought. Copernicus believed in a design creator. He believed that we were special. He believed that the rational format of the universe around us was extremely special, and that we were put in the position that we are in, on the earth that we're on, in the position that it's in, with the ability to observe the universe around us, with a rational mind to quantify the laws of nature, all as special gifts from God. So,
why do you think modern day scientists tend to try to convince us that scientists from the 18th and 17th and 16th and 15th and beyond century were not religious or faithful or God-believing people, or that their theories weren't based around?
I find that so interesting because historical science is misquoted so often in current scientific literature.
Yeah.
Like, you can go back and look at Newton, and a lot of people want to say the same thing about Newton. They want to say that Newton basically said that, we didn't need God. But if you go back and read Newton's papers where they cite, those quotes from Newton, those are not actually true. You go back and look at the Latin papers written by Newton, you can do that. Anybody can go research that. But it's not true. It's misquoted over and over and over again. You have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's, a superstar scientist on television who quotes these things. You go back and research them and they're false. And it's like, wait, science is supposed to be the empirical proof of truth. Yet these people are using these false quotes and they're not doing any actual research on the history of science. And I believe it comes down to subscribing to an ideology where science coming from a theistic belief doesn't match their current ideology. And so I think that's why they use these false quotes. They go back and rewrite history. I mean, we're seeing that now in our society, right? Where history is being rewritten.
Yeah.
People want to go back and basically rewrite history to fit their current ideological model. They'll go so far as tearing down physical structures that represent the truth of history in order to get rid of them so that their version of history can be adopted accurately, right? Tell a lie enough times and eventually it becomes the truth, but that in and of itself is a very dangerous premise. That's how you get things like Stalin and, right, what happened in early Russia. That's how you get things like Hitler and what happened in Germany.
That's how new religions are started,
yes,
right?
Yes, to a certain degree.
In many cases, probably.
Well, you say world religions are started by false belief systems?
For sure.
Well, I think most religions...
Not necessarily belief systems, but
Yeah.
I think over time, it's easy to start to mold, history, again, to
I
what
can
you want
see
it
how
to be.
prescriptions in religion could become, right, like false antics of a true principle. Because I believe that theism in and of itself is a true principle.
Yeah.
Which would mean that all religion is built on a logical foundation that is true.
Yeah.
We'll get into why theism and epistemology, our ability to comprehend the world around us, are the best fit. Because they allow for a cognitive alignment in our life that helps us to operate in a rational framework. Whereas anything outside of theism causes cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
So I think there's an important distinction there where the premise for a lot of science is I don't think helpful.
Yeah.
Right? That God doesn't exist, which is kind of the premise for like a neo-Darwinist evolutionary subset or framework today. I don't think is built on truth. I don't think it's a helpful framework.
Which that subset or framework didn't really exist at the time of the folks that we're talking
it happened
about.
through the Enlightenment period, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Back then, these people operated on a theistic belief system.
Yeah.
And they attributed intelligent design to the framework of their scientific discovery, which I think is brilliant. You have like some microbiologists today that are doing the same thing, where they're looking at some of these, parts of the cell that we're going to get into later that are highly designed. And so what they're doing is they're employing a design metric oversight to their scientific discovery, and it's moving them leaps and bounds further than scientists who are trying to explain things through random mutation and natural selection processes. They're taking a design overlay. They'll go hire a mechanical engineer from, a company like Boeing in order to understand a cell that's formed like a,
jet engine.
Yeah, like a jet engine.
Yeah.
And then
turbine.
Using that design framework, they can make postulations about how the cell's going to function and what's inside of it. And then they can move science forward because as they postulate and then test, they're accurate. Whereas a non-design framework, a non-theistic framework, is going to use just random guesses at what should happen. It's going to take you down a path that's different than a design framework is, right? We can see that, as we kind of get into some of the discussions around the origin of man, where species come from and some of those other things.
So before we get into Darwin's Origin of Species and theory of evolution, why start with the idea that science is built on religious axioms, right? Like, does this actually provide proof or consensus, or is there more work for us to do to unpack this?
Yeah, I mean, well, it is based on religious axioms. That's a fact. Okay. The truth as a moral value is religious. Okay. That can only be found in a religious or theistic belief system.
Yeah.
So that in and of itself is truth, right? Could there be some discussion about, I don't know, moral relativism? Yeah, but it always ends up to the place where if you believe or subscribe to moral relativity, you have to be able to appeal to a higher authority, because otherwise it breaks down and it becomes relative to you and I on a spectrum.
Yeah.
And anything on an infinite spectrum is insanity.
Yeah.
So if you want to put morals on a infinite spectrum, it breaks down, because if what you say is good, I think is bad, then how do we have a cohesive framework that allows us to function as a society?
Yep.
We really don't. So I think it's empirically true that science is based on religious axioms. Now, why do I make that argument to start this conversation? Is because I come from a vantage point that I think theism is the best belief system.
Mm-hmm.
I think it holds most true through, a lot of different arguments, whether that's moral relativity, whether that's epistemology, whether that's, metaphysical questions. I think from a theological standpoint, theism is the only way to operate.
Yeah.
Because everything else breaks down outside of that belief system.
I watched a viral video that BBC produced 4 years ago. And in this video, at the end of the video, they said, evolution is a fact. Okay. There's like no denying that evolution is a fact. What do you say to that as we start talking about the simplest argument for evolution currently?
Well, sure. So evolution is a broad term. Okay. I think Stephen Myers said it essentially covers 6 different areas. So I believe that some of those areas are factual. Okay. I do believe that there are parts of evolution that are factual, but I think that the general belief of the public that, we started from a simple blob of protoplasm and became this complex functioning system that we are now is diabolically false. Like diametrically opposed to science.
Yeah.
Okay. So, for them to say evolution broadly is a fact, I would say comes from a biased subset in their whatever belief system, right? So they're coming at it through a biased lens. I find that oftentimes in conversation or argument, when somebody speaks in absolutes that are not nuanced, they're extremely biased and they're typically not right. So when I get heated with my kids or my wife and I say something like, you always, that is almost never accurate.
For sure.
And so I think when anybody speaks like that in extremely absolute terms with no nuance to their broad prescription of fact,
yeah,
that they're operating in an ideology more than they are in a truth-seeking mindset.
Can we, before we dive into
Yep.
Darwin's theory of evolution, can we just high level talk about these? I have 5 parts that I want to read off,
Yeah.
and I may be missing one because you
Sure.
said there's 6. Okay,
I can't remember all 6, but
so evolution as such is number 1, which I think sort of encapsulates the next 4 points that are very important. Common descent, so that everything can be traced back to a common ancestor.
Yep.
What you just talked about.
Empirically false, but we'll get into it.
Gradualism, that evolutionary changes occur gradually over long periods of time.
Okay. Empirically false, so we'll get into it.
And long is like an understatement,
Yeah.
like extremely long periods of time.
Yes,
Okay.
billions and billions of years.
Yeah. Population speciation, which is that evolution occurs over populations not
so
individuals.
We'll get into DNA, the DNA aspect of evolution.
And then natural selection, right? That
Yep.
traits that enhance an organism's ability to survive and reproduce become more common in a population over successive generations.
Okay, so that is talking about the design mechanism of Darwinian evolution. And we'll get into that as well. If random mutation and natural selection is a viable means for moving from a simple celled organism to, a human being.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are good aspects to Darwinism, but I think you'll see as we get into this argument that there's some pretty insurmountable evidence against most of those.
Okay, let's dive in.
Cool. So Darwin's Origin of Species, that's the book that Darwin originally wrote, which is kind of funny because the one question it doesn't answer is the origin of species. He actually says that in his book.
He wanted to when he chose the title.
I guess, but it's just funny that he named it that and then actually doesn't even talk about the origin of species. So I go through, I just want to talk about some arguments, in Darwin's theory of evolution. I think the simplest argument for everybody, even, the lamest of laymen's, is where can we observe evolution currently? So the lack of case for evolution is clear from the fact that no one has ever seen it happen. If it were a real process, evolution should still be occurring and there should be many transitional forms that we could observe.
Okay.
Right? So we've all seen in the elementary textbook the evolution of chimpanzee to man.
Yeah.
Isn't that picture just like enshrined in your brain?
Yeah.
Where it's like the hunched over ape that then starts standing more as he becomes Homo erectus.
Yeah.
Right. And eventually becomes Homo sapien. But the question that any, I think, rational thinker who isn't ideologically biased would say is, where are the half monkeys today? Where is this species that can semi-communicate like humans and infer meaning to the universe around them, but isn't quite at the level that we're at? Because we have monkeys.
Well, they've become extinct.
Okay, but the monkeys didn't?
No, they did. And they're buried somewhere on the earth that we haven't discovered yet.
Yeah, but we still have apes. We have chimpanzees.
But the half ones.
But what about the chimpanzees that are evolving into half ones? The chimpanzees are here.
Doesn't line up. It's impossible.
Well, so, I think from a very simple standpoint, to be able to trust our cognitive processes, to be able to look at the known universe around us and see that we cannot observe any form of evolution is almost in and of itself an insurmountable objection.
Haven't you ever seen like these people? Like, let me just show you a photo. Okay.
You're going to have to do some mental gymnastics.
Okay, check this out. Like, haven't you ever seen like guys that look like this, that are like these super hairy humans? Like, what if that's the half apes?
No, it's not. Because if you go talk to that guy, he's got cognitive abilities like a human being. I promise you that person can reason out the environment around them. And so if he was an ape, he would function like an ape. But apes don't function like we do. That's a movie called Planet of the Apes, where when they do function like humans, and they're halfway between, so they have ape-like strength with the cognitive abilities of a human, they take over the human race. Yeah. Because chimps don't have the gene that causes them to not be able to flex their muscles to 100%.
So the half monkey argument is a great argument.
Yeah. Well, or any of those observable mutations, that we want to talk about. Yeah. Going from a single cell organism to a more complex, or find one place in the observable universe where we can see that. There are none. So then why is evolution a thing? Well, the argument to that there's no observable evolutionary process currently going on, is that it moves too slow. Okay. So claiming that evolution goes too slowly for us to see it happening today. They used to claim that the real evidence for evolution was in the fossil record of the past. But the fact is that billions of known fossils do not include a single unequivocal transitional form with transitional structures in the process of evolving.
That to me is my favorite point, right? So I saw a guy talk about this and he said this. He said, to go from a primeval ape to a human being takes trillions of transitional forms. He said Darwin talked about this in his book, The Origin of Species, that we would find eventually the trillions of forms from ape to human being. We haven't found trillions. We haven't even found billions or millions or thousands or hundreds or tens. We've maybe found a couple.
2 that science claims.
Yeah.
And neither one of them is empirically verified. One is a dinosaur with feathers, and the other is a walking whale. It's like, come on, you guys. That's the best you can do in the fossil record. So yeah, according to Darwin, evolution is a continual state of motion. It followed logically that the fossil record should be rife with examples of transitional forms leading from the less to the more evolved.
Yeah.
There ought therefore to be a considerable number of true transitional structures preserved in the fossil. After all, there are billions of non-transitional structures there, with the exception of a few very doubtful creatures, such as the controversial feathered dinosaur and the alleged walking whales. They're not there. Instead of filling in the gaps in the fossil record with so-called missing links, most paleontologists found themselves facing a situation in which there were only gaps in the fossil record with no evidence of transformational intermediaries between the documented fossil species. That actually seems like a great segue into what's called the Cambrian Explosion.
Yeah.
In my notes here, I'm going to skip forward and let's talk about the Cambrian Explosion.
Yeah.
What is the Cambrian Explosion? And what did they find in the fossil record?
Mm-hmm.
Where am I at for Cambrian Explosion?
Page 5 at the bottom.
2, 3, 4, 5.
One more, maybe?
Epistemology. What's the top of it say?
The main scientific reason. Yeah.
This is it.
Maybe
Yep.
page 4.
You
Yeah.
got it.
Okay.
Page 5, you're accurate. So, Cambrian Explosion. Where am I at? Oh, Cambrian Explosion. So, what the Cambrian Explosion is essentially the excavation of the fossil record and what geologists and paleontologists have found.
Yeah.
So, that's another thing that's interesting to me is if you posit a scientific theory, ideally from that theory, you would be able to have like heuristic probabilities, the ability to estimate the future, right? Or things that you would find. So it's like if Darwin's theory of evolution is the posited scientific theory, then we should be able to say in the fossil record, you would find, right, these slow, evolutionary, easily trackable, prehistoric or ancestral, closely related mutations over time. But that's not what happens. So the Cambrian Explosion, which is essentially a period around 530 million years ago, when a wide array of complex animal forms appeared in the fossil record, is basically stumped paleontologists, geologists, anybody who's doing fossil record research in how it can be applied to Darwin's theory of evolution. Because what they found is this. You have all of the plant life, the fauna in the fossil record basically comes into existence all at once in a very short period of time. You're talking like 30 to 50 million years, I believe. And it has no prior historical fossil record with it. No closely related historical ancestral fossils, nothing like that. It just jumps into the fossil record. Then you go from all of the fauna, plant life, to all of the winged insect creatures. Now, there should have been like this slow evolutionary process where a Venus flytrap then, right, got wings, and then it was like a winged flying, like go from plant to flying winged insect. But that's not what happened. You have these drastically different molecular structures of new creatures with no evolutionary process between the two. No prior historical fossil record of any kind of a closely related ancestral makeup. And then you go from winged insects to all of the mammalian creatures. Same thing. No prior historical fossil record, no slow incremental evolutionary process. And then the difference between a winged insect and a mammalian creature is so drastic. You're talking about the trillions of different systems that would have had to have been built inside of these processes over time to get from this species to this species. Well, Darwin's theory of evolution posited that we should have seen gradual change in the fossil record, and we see none of that.
So why do they call this an explosion?
Because in an evolutionary perspective, in order for the amount of change to have taken place that does, it should have been hundreds of billions of years. Whereas in the Cambrian Explosion, it's like 30 to 50 million years. It's like a tenth of a tenth of a tenth of the time that evolution would have needed in order to create even just small increments of that. To go from where winged insects to mammalian creatures, I mean, you're talking it should have been probably in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions of years.
Yeah.
Instead, it's like in a 50 million year period, which really just flies in the face of Darwinian evolution, right? Yeah. So Charles Darwin acknowledged this event as a significant challenge to his theory of evolution. He then explores the explosion's magnitude, highlighting the sudden appearance of diverse, complex organisms without clear evolutionary precursors.
So where did they come from? Then.
You'd have to tell me. To me, in a theistic belief framework, it's intelligent design.
Yeah.
That's the only place where we see leaps of that magnitude in change of systems with new information code and entirely new systems. You know, that's the only place where we see leaps of that advancement, like technologically, molecularly, biologically, is with intelligent design behind it.
Could God technically today create more complex animal forms if he wanted to? Right? So like at some point, Adam and Eve came.
You're positing, can God do other things? If you believe in the God that most religions do, sure. He's an omniscient, all-powerful.
But wouldn't it be interesting to like sort of trace back and say, okay, over hundreds of millions of years, he has created different, in segments of time, different intelligent beings, animal forms.
Creatures, yeah.
Eventually, he creates humans that become the most complex.
The crowning...
The crowning pinnacle of all animal forms, right? Therefore,
distinct and different from, because of our intellectual capability.
Therefore, it's also possible that he could introduce a new animal form today.
Sure.
That would be more intelligent than we are.
Well, what's interesting is that we do this in our own way. Humans. We design and create all sorts of sophisticated machines.
Yeah.
Right? We've created computers, which in certain aspects of intelligence, computers are more advanced than us.
Yeah, for sure.
Take an AI that can digest all of the known information on the internet.
Yeah.
And then posit answers to you as you ask questions. Mm-hmm. Alexa, Siri, all right, ChatGPT. These are extremely sophisticated machines that we have created. So, I think that's a whole nother argument. I think there's some brilliant aspects to human intellect that really it transcends the physical universe. I mean, like we talked about, I think in the last episode, something called the 2-slit experiment. I don't get into that in any of this, but what's interesting to me, so that experiment, if you're familiar with it, did you go look at it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they shoot light waves through slits in a board. And what happens is light acts as a wave, but when they observe it, it becomes back to a particle. Okay. So it goes from wave to particle. And when they observe it in real time, after it's already become a wave and has hit the, measuring apparatus, light actually like goes back in time and changes to a proton. So like they could have measured it as a wave here, but then when you put an intelligent observer on it, the wave measurement here actually becomes a particle in the machine that was measuring it. So it like goes back in time and it changes the data input that was taken by the machine that measured it as a wave prior. What's interesting to me in that experiment is the experiment in and of itself is crazy. If you've never looked at it, you should go look at it. But what's interesting to me is that the machine that's recording it goes from wave to, back to particle. The human mind sees that and says, wait, it said wave. Now it's saying particle, which says what? That the intelligent intellect of the human mind is somehow outside of the physical universe that we operate in.
Yeah.
Because that machine, it changed its data input. But the human mind is able to operate outside of that parameter and say like, whoa, hold on a minute. That just changed. And it's like, we can observe it. Whereas anything rational that's recording it, that's physical, just changes with it. So it's like, okay, that stuff's like part of the matrix and we're outside of the matrix. I mean, you can make kind of a funny argument talking about this idea that the world is, like a simulation.
Yeah, simulation theory.
I mean, one of the things that simulation theory's gone gangbusters with in the last little bit is the James Webb Telescope. I don't know if you've heard any of this.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, so it's like Hubble measured, the expansion rate of the universe based on the observable light spectrum as one thing. The James Webb Telescope, which is observing things in the infrared spectrum, observed it in like a different way. And they're having this, what they call the cosmological crisis, which is the James Webb Telescope is showing different ages of universes and light and some of these things than the Hubble telescope. And one of the things that people posit is the universe being rendered like a graphics engine. So I don't know, are you familiar with how graphics engines render in a game?
Yeah, like Unreal Engine.
Yeah. So like when you are playing a game or you're in a simulation in a computer, what a graphics engine does is it takes things that are close, it renders them fully, it gives them detail. But things that are like off in the distance, like maybe the mountains, it doesn't fully render because it doesn't have to, because you can't actually see it. And so it saves this computing power. Yeah. Preservation of energy, right? Like it's an intelligent design. It's what solved the CPU or GPU problem for us in computers when trying to do complex systems, is that we realized we only had to render what was necessary. And then as we take a step further, we render the next step. Take a step further, we render the next step. Well, people kind of posit that what happened is the James Webb Telescope, which is observing things that we've never observed before because it's in a light spectrum that we don't observe naturally, is seeing things for the first time. And it's like they're being rendered in real time as a graphics engine would. And it's like, that's an interesting conversation to have when you start to look at things like the two-slit experiment, quantum physics, the universe that we're now seeing through different light spectrums being rendered almost like a graphics engine and causing these weird, struggles between light that we've viewed previously and now light spectrums that we're seeing, where we're looking at galaxies we've never observed that are, 13.6 billion light years away, but they're acting as if they're, half the age. It's like, I don't know. There's some interesting questions there from a scientific theory standpoint, but that's kind of a tangent, that we went off on.
Yeah, that could be a fun one to unpack at some point.
The Cambrian Explosion, to me, another great argument against Darwin's theory of evolution, because if you were to posit a scientific theory that said there is an intelligent designer behind the rational universe that we live in, you would expect to find in the fossil record these large swaths of immediate and highly differentiated creation, which is what we find in the strata of the earth as we continue to dig. right?
Let's contemplate doing a simulation theory exercise or entire episode.
Yeah.
I think that would be a really fun one to unpack.
Really mind-blowing.
Just the definition of simulation is interesting to start to think about, because it's like, well, could the definition of simulation just be God's plan, for example? And does it actually matter what this is?
So I have a brother that's really smart who's actually on a spiritual journey right now.
Yeah.
And we were talking about entropy and syntropy. Okay. So we live in an entropic universe. What does that mean? Entropy is chaos. Everything breaks down. Okay. So we live in an environment where everything breaks down to its simplest form. Second law of thermodynamics, which we'll get into. It's a criticism of Darwin's theory of evolution. But we were talking about entropy and syntropy, and we live in an entropic universe. But entropy is not good. So like if we view entropy in the past, how do you feel? So the destruction of something in the past. So let's take, for example, the Holocaust. How do we feel about the destruction of the Jewish race in the past? Insanely remorseful.
Yeah.
Right? So sad. Even maybe a little angry about some of those things that happened. So entropy in the past causes us all these negative feelings when we look at it. Entropy in the present. How do you feel about entropy now, when things around you are breaking down and going awry? And yeah, it causes anger, it causes resentment, it causes all these negative feelings.
Mm-hmm.
How about entropy in the future, when you reflect or look forward to, things that can break down in the future? What does that cause?
I mean, the same thing.
Anxiety, right? Worry of the future. Okay, so all feelings associated with entropy are negative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the opposite of entropy is something called syntropy. Okay, so syntropy is essentially the preservation, the order, it's fixing and preserving and creating. So how do we feel about syntropy in the past as things are preserved from the past? We feel awe or reverence towards. We feel, grateful for, love and desire towards. How about syntropy in the current? When we create, well, that's the juice of life.
Love and connection.
That's the juice of life.
Yeah.
Progress. We feel fulfilled. We feel, right? All these things. How do we feel about syntropic endeavors in the future?
Hopeful and
That's
grateful.
what keeps us motivated, is working towards an infinite reference point, right? With Sartre, who we talked about in the previous one, where no finite point has any meaning without an infinite reference point. So this ability to project into the future and to move forward. So God is all things good. Well, syntropy is all good things. It's love, essentially. Love, I think, could be the definition as, my brother gave me an interesting definition. It was like the preservation, the remembrance, preservation, or creation of something good. He's like, that's essentially what love is. That's how we feel love. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting definition for love. And he said, and that matches perfectly with the feelings that come from syntropy. Now, if there was a being who was eternal, who was all-knowing, perfect, operated in love, he would be the embodiment of syntropy. There could not exist in him any type of entropy, because if it did, it would destroy itself over time. Now, the opposite of an all-knowing syntropic being would be what? An entropic being who wanted to destroy everything that the syntropic being was creating. Well, what do we know about Satan? He wants to tear down and destroy anything that God has built.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you think about us. We live in an entropic universe. Are we entropic beings? Does man destroy everything around him?
No.
No, what does man do? Man orders the universe.
Yeah.
He orders everything around him, and he wants to make sense and rationally order all things that he sees and comprehends. So man is a syntropic being. So we are syntropic beings sent to an entropic universe where all we do is spend all of our time fighting entropy. That's all we do all day, every day, is we fight entropy. We fix our home, we fix our car, we fix our life, we fix our relationships, we fix our businesses, we just on and on and on and on. So if you want to talk about a simulation, at the end in Christian literature, there's a great war. The war is between who?
Jesus and Satan.
Yeah, God and Satan. Syntropy and entropy. We are syntropic beings in an entropic universe, learning to fight entropy all day, every day. When it comes to warring against entropy at the end of this thing, what are we going to know? We're going to know how to fight entropy almost perfectly because we have spent our entire existence fighting entropy. So there's some really neat dynamics that come in when you start
in this
to
video
look,
game.
Yes. When you start to look at life as a simulation, right? It's like, that's mega. Some other things I think are super brilliant is like, one of the things I was talking to my brother about is we were talking about how science wants to say that cause and effect is like a fact, and we live in an entropic universe. But what's interesting about us syntropic beings with intelligence is we can actually move through the time spectrum with intelligence. What do I mean by that? We can cause and effect. We can affect a cause before it actually happens. How do we do that? Well, we do that all the time by looking into the future for entropic things that are going to happen. A hurricane's coming. And then what do? In the past, we create an effect that stops the cause and eliminates the effect of a future event. So like if a hurricane is coming, we know that the cause and the effect of the hurricane are going to happen. But we act prior to that in order to stop the outcome of this cause, right? So we make an effect in the past to stop a cause and effect in the future. With intelligence, we essentially travel through time. We look at the future, we make something happen in the past that stops an effect in the future from happening. We do that all the time, but you don't actually ever really think about that. We do it naturally, but it's like this super interesting aspect to like a simulation theory where you can say like, we're kind of like in the universe, but we're not actually of the universe. The intelligent factors of our mind can operate in nonlinear time. We can think in nonlinear time. We can go forward, we can go backwards, we can be in the present. Now, the outcome of our of our actions function in linear time because we're bound linear in this environment that we're in. But it's like, to me, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, there's a whole other like side of that coin, which is the, like, you view this in a centristic like mentality, which is a very healthy way, I think, to look at it. But then you have like the nihilistic camp that views it as, well, I can go murder somebody because I'm in this simulation and there will be no consequence.
Or that humans are all destructive.
We're all destructive.
We're destroying the world we live on. We're killing each other.
I can kill myself. It doesn't matter. It's part of the game. The game will continue, sort of thing. Right?
Yeah, there's a whole subreddit for nihilism. A bunch of people who don't care about anything, who aren't going to have kids, who don't care to build anything productive, who just want to tear down society because they believe that it's not worth anything. Because they subscribe mainly to scientific materialism. I have a quote in here from Bertrand Russell that I think almost perfectly encapsulates the nihilistic idealism. That man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. That his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental calcations of atoms. That no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. That all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. What kind of mind frame is that to operate in?
Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, that just sounds so nice.
Brutal.
Just
Brutal. So Tangent City.
Should we get back to
evolution?
Evolution.
Yep.
Are we on junk DNA? Is this where we left off?
Yeah, I think we're talking about DNA similarities.
Okay.
So bottom of the second page. Because evolutionists, having largely become disenfranchised with the fossil record as a witness for evolution because of the ubiquitous gaps where there should be transitions, recently have been promoting DNA and other genetic evidence as proof of evolution. However, as noted by even Roger Lewin, a staunch evolutionist, this is often inconsistent with not only the fossil record, but also with the comparative morphology of the creatures. Lewin also mentions just a few typical contradictions yielded by this type of evidence in relation to more traditional Darwinian proofs. So he talks about the elephant shrew, which is consigned by traditional analysis to the order of insectivores. So insectivores are essentially creatures that just eat insects, for sustenance. But that creature who is part of the insectivores is in fact more closely related to the true elephant through a DNA analysis. So it's in like a completely different subset of Darwinian evolution to the elephant. But DNA says that they're actually closely related.
Yeah, i.e. the physical appearance of a animal has really very little to do with the way that the DNA molecular level is built.
Correct. So like you may have a subset of creatures that in Darwin's theory of evolution are extremely unique, but in DNA, they're closely related.
It's that next example.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Cows are more closely related to dolphins than they are horses.
Yes. But in Darwin's evolutionary tree, they're in the same line.
That's right.
But it's like, no, in the DNA tree, they're in totally different camps. So there is no way to really prove Darwin's evolutionary fossil record through DNA because it's just so upended when you look at the similarity through DNA. So what we see in DNA relation does not actually show any type of correlation to the evolutionary tree. So, but the problem is this, you're already seeing that in this scientific theory that's been posited, when they're met with an objection, what do? Well, they use mental gymnastics or they scramble for some other explanation. And then they use that explanation for a little while. They prop up this entropic philosophy because it's just being destroyed because it's not based on a true foundational principle of truth. And so they prop it up with these other things. But then we dig into that and what happens? We find out that leg is corrosive as well, and it's not going to hold up because the premise for it is not built on truth. It's got some entropy in it, and it is a logical fallacy which destroys itself over time.
Yeah.
So anything that's not logical, that's based on a fallible belief system, over time destroys itself. That's what logical fallacies are. It's a divergence from the logic strain in order to make a point that can't be comprehended logically.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's what science does in the Darwinian theory of evolution is this Darwinian evolution is fallible. It's not in the logical strain. And so then it destroys itself and then they prop it up with something else and that destroys itself and they prop it up with something else. It's like the fossil record will prove it. No, it doesn't. DNA will prove it. No, it doesn't. Right? On and on and on and on.
When did we start to have advanced enough scientific research to start to really disprove Darwin's theory of evolution generally?
Probably 1930.
Okay, so it's been 100 years.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not like in
1930 we started to disprove it. Watson and Crick found DNA in the 60s. So that's only been 70 years. But as recent as 100 years ago, or as long ago as 100 years, we started to disprove Darwin's theory of evolution. So you take then the DNA relation doesn't function. They wanted to use junk DNA as another form of saying the evolutionary process and show that there was all these aspects to DNA. So they kind of want to discredit the design aspect of DNA.
Yeah,
because they're like, well, we're going to use DNA as scientific proof of evolution, but we can't show that it's too highly designed because that will lead way to people thinking it was intelligently designed.
Yeah. So they came up with this concept of garbage or junk DNA that didn't matter.
Yeah. So they said that, up to, I think it was like 90% of the DNA molecule was junk. But as now we've gotten into molecular biology and being able to understand the human genome and researching DNA, we find that junk DNA is not actually a thing.
Mm-hmm.
What we thought was junk DNA, which we thought was this evolutionary process of this mindless, random mutation and natural selection over time, which left these large swaths of DNA as junk in the human genome, is actually not that at all. They're intrinsic parts of other aspects of life. Maybe not genes that are encoded at the beginning of life, but have other unique aspects to how we function. So an example that I found recently of junk DNA was the University of California, Berkeley, and Washington University explored the function of one component of this junk DNA. It's called transposons, which are selfish DNA sequences able to invade their host genome. The study shows that at least one family of transposons, ancient viruses that have invaded our genome by the millions, plays a critical role in the viability in the mouse and perhaps in all mammals. When the researchers knocked out a specific transposon in mice, half their mouse pups died before birth. So what they found was that in that junk DNA portion, the transposons regulates the proliferation of cells in the early fertilized embryo, and that the timing of implantation in the mother's uterus. So what they essentially found is that junk DNA had a portion of it that was vital to embryonic life. And what we're continuing to find out is that junk DNA is not junk DNA. As we continue to delve into it, we find other aspects to this junk DNA that are intrinsic parts of how the cell functions. Coded information that is, being put out in different ways. So it's just interesting because they keep having to jump from one to the next, to the next, to the next to try and prop up this, which I think is a completely disproven theory of evolution.
Who's they?
Yeah, scientific materialists. So people who operate in this ideology that all things in the world have to be explained by natural means.
Yeah.
So it's people. And what's so interesting to me is you've got this whole group of scientists who have a discrimination before they even get involved in scientific research. So if that were the case in any other field of research, take archaeology, for example. If we went into archaeology and we said that intelligent design cannot be contributed to anything we find in archaeology. So we dig up an old tablet that has some Sanskrit language on it, but we are not willing to contribute or attribute intelligent design to the writings on this tablet that we find.
Yeah.
How do we explain this tablet then? Wind corrosion, sand, and all these other things that through random mutation and natural selection over time created something that looks like design, but is not actually designed. Because that's what a lot of the scientific naturalists will say. You take like Richard Dawkins, for example, staunch Darwinist, atheistic belief system. His famous quote is that, basically the universe, while it looks designed, is not. And at its bottom is basically, what does he say? Something pitiless indifference. The quote I gave at the beginning of the series.
Yeah.
Blind, pitiless indifference. It's like, okay, so it looks designed, but it's actually not. It's just blind, pitiless indifference. It's like you could not apply that mindset to any other field of research and be taken seriously. But for some reason, in the scientific method of evolution, you can. Okay.
What is the second law of thermodynamics?
Yeah, great question. So the second law of thermodynamics is this, that in any closed system, energy dissipates and everything degrades to its simplest form, essentially. So, the main scientific reason why there is no evidence for evolution is either in either the present or the past is because of the most fundamental laws of nature. One of the most fundamental laws of nature preclude it. The law of increasing entropy, also known as the second law of thermodynamics. This law stipulates that all systems in the real world tend to go downhill, as it were, toward disorganization and decreased complexity. This law of entropy is, by any measure, one of the most universal, best proved laws of nature. It applies not only in physical and chemical systems, but also biological and geological systems. In fact, in all systems without exception. So, this is the idea that take an apple, put it outside, and it becomes an apple orchard. No, that apple becomes dust. It doesn't become an iPhone from Apple. So in the observable universe, we never see any system that goes from simple to complex unless there is an intelligent mind, rational thought process, somebody designing it. It's funny because there's a lot of scientists who will say, well, we have scientists that were able to take an experiment and go from a simple experiment here and then create a more complex life form out of these simpler forms. And they want to use that as proof that the theory of evolution could be accurate. But the interesting aspect to that is it's scientists in a lab making that happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They are the intelligent designer behind what they quote as natural process that's happening. So it's like a self-defeating argument. You can't show me any scientific experiment where it goes from simple to more complex and not invalidate that experiment because there's an intelligent designer behind it. In nature, we can't observe that anywhere because of the second law of thermodynamics, which is, if not, probably one of the most, if not the most proven law of nature.
Yeah. And it says there's no exception to the second law of thermodynamics that has ever been found, not even a tiny one.
Yeah.
Not even one.
Yeah.
Right?
Like conservation of energy, the first law, the existence of a law so precise and so independent of details of models must have a logical foundation that is independent of the fact that matter is composed of interacting particles.
Yeah. In the common descent portion of the theory of evolution, that everything can be traced back to a common ancestor. Is there consensus what that initial common ancestor is? So in your case, you're talking about an apple. Was this a plant? Was it a fruit? Was it a ape? Was it a piece of dust?
So what you're talking about in common ancestry would be back to the DNA argument. Okay, we're not talking about in the fossil record.
Right.
The fossil record does not go back to any common ancestry.
Yeah.
So I don't see what, even if we could get back to a common ancestor in DNA, has any significance to Darwin's theory of evolution. How does that help Darwin's theory of evolution?
Right.
That DNA shows that we came back from a single being, but the fossil record shows that we're a massive subset of entirely different creatures. It's like that we all came from a single race. I don't know really makes any difference.
It doesn't make a difference, but is there consensus? Do we know? Does any of these modern day, Darwinists?
So the problem with DNA is that as we discover more and more and more, it invalidates itself the same way science does. So I don't know that there is any general conclusion right now that we go back to a common ancestor. There is at times, right? They'll find a strain of DNA that goes back and they'll be like, oh, this goes back to such and such a time and everybody came out of this portion. And it's like, but then they find new research that shows like, oh, wait, there was an offshoot of this over here that's actually more ancient. And then, so it just continues to branch out into these more abstract understandings or more nuanced understandings of what DNA is, how it functions, its, predictive capabilities, the historical accuracy of what we're trying to determine. It's like, it's really difficult.
Speaking of absolute truth, though, what is the absolute truth in your mind of where this all started?
Well, the absolute truth for me is that DNA does exist. Okay, that's an absolute truth.
Yeah.
We know that DNA exists and that it is a highly complex system that uses language, coding, which another absolute truth is we only find information from an intelligent mind. This is actually one of the most difficult arguments for scientific materialists is the origin of information. There has never been posited any scientific theory as to where the origin of information comes from. And DNA is information, highly specific, categorized, intellectual, almost like computer code type information. And the only place where we find information in the observable universe is from an intelligent mind. So that to me is true because you can see it. It's been proven out in theory. So it's like, yeah, I think the origin of information is probably one of the most empirically true facts that you can find is that information only comes from an intelligent mind. So there are some arguments against, say, the second law of thermodynamics. It applies to closed loop systems, right? So systems in which there is not additional energy being input. Some people want to make an argument that the earth or the universe is an open system. We have a sun that, right, gives energy and that those things can argue out, maybe that evolution could happen over time. But, I wrote the naive response to the entropy law is typical of evolutionary dissimulation. While it is true that local order can increase in an open system if certain conditions are met, the fact is that evolution does not meet those conditions. Simply saying that the earth is open to the energy from the sun says nothing about how that raw solar heat is converted into increased complexity in any system, open or closed. The fact is that the best known and most fundamental equation of thermodynamics says that the influx of heat in an open system will increase the entropy of that system, not decrease it. So again, you have this argument from a scientific community trying to prop up a phallical belief system that then when actually delved into with the science disproves itself at even a greater level.
Yeah.
Right. So they're like, well, the sun, which provides energy, could have been the catalyst and Earth functions as an open system. It's like, no, thermodynamics proves that actually introducing heat into a system increases the entropy over time, degradation to a simpler form.
Yep. So,
evolution has neither of these. Mutations are not organizing mechanisms, but disorganizing. Or the fact, this is what I meant to read. The fact is that the best known and most fundamental equation shows that it degrades. In open systems involve a guiding program of some sort of one or more energy conservation mechanisms. So in order for heat to actually produce something in a closed system, it has to have an intelligent organizer of that behind it is the only way that we see that it improves it. So that argument that heat in a system could potentially provide for increased complexity actually helps prove intelligent design, because the only time we see heat increase productivity in a system is when it's intelligently directed in that system.
Yep.
So again, it goes back to, a proof in the wrong direction. So it talks about how evolution has neither of those. Mutations are not organizing mechanisms, but disorganizing in accord with the second law. They are commonly harmful, sometimes neutral, but never beneficial. Natural selection cannot generate order, but can only sieve out the disorganizing mutations presented to it, thereby conserving the existing order, but never generating new order. In principle, it may be barely conceivable that evolution could occur in open systems in spite of the tendency of all systems to disintegrate sooner or later. But no one yet has been able to show that it actually has the ability to overcome this universal tendency. And that is the basic reason why there's still no bona fide proof of evolution, past or present. So a pretty solid argument there. Second law of thermodynamics.